Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I am participating in the Spring Garden Hop with Pajama Crafter Stamps over on Instagram. And I wanted to create a video for the card that I'm creating for that. And I'm using the In Our Hearts Always stamp set as well as the Birds of a Feather stamp set with some interference watercolor. And I'm going to use that In Our Hearts Always stamp set to create a wreath. So it's got a curved branch in it, and I'm going to do that twice. I'm going to create that branch twice and then do some fussy cutting, and I'm going to turn it into a wreath. So just because a stamp, if you will, is a certain shape, it doesn't mean you can't do it multiple times and turn it into something just a little bit different. So I'm using some watercolor cardstock here because I do want to watercolor with some interference inks. I'm going to heat emboss the image with some silver embossing powder just to have a little bit of a metallic touch to it. If you prefer gold, you could actually do gold embossing powder here too, or instead. Of the two, my preference is silver, so I opted to go with that, but gold would work, and it would even work with the colors of interference inks I'm using as well, because I'm going to do some green leaves with some yellow at the end, so that gold embossing powder would work there. So I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my watercolor cardstock before stamping it with some VersaMark ink. I did use my Misti stamping tool in order to stamp it so I could stamp it a couple times, make sure I have a nice crisp full image there. And then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder. And I'm going to repeat that same process because I want this curved branch twice in order to make my wreath. And I'm also going to use one of the birds from that Birds of a Feather stamp set to create a bird sitting in that wreath. You could swap that bird out for something else or eliminate it entirely, but because that hop with the Pajama Crafter Stamps, the theme is spring garden, I always think of birds in spring because where I live anyways, you can tell that it's getting a little bit warmer because the birds are getting a little bit louder, a little bit more chirpy. So for me, that was the perfect thing to go in the center of this wreath. So once I have my second branch heat embossed, I'm going to take one of the birds and I'm going to use it or stamp it and emboss it in the corner of my watercolor cardstock. There's several different birds to choose from in that stamp set. So I wanted to wait until I had the branch done in order to be able to just kind of place the stamp on top just to make sure that the bird that I was choosing was the one that I wanted for in there. So I repeated the same process. I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock, stamped it a couple times with VersaMark ink before pouring on some silver embossing powder, tapping the excess off and using my heat tool to heat emboss that powder on the cardstock. Now I'm also going to fussy cut the bird as well so that it fits in the wreath and you can see the background of the card nicely. So before I go and do my fussy cutting, I want to watercolor my pieces here. Now I'm going to be using my interference ink pads for this. So interference ink pads, if you haven't seen me use them, I use them a lot. So you probably, if you've been here and seen any of my videos, you've probably seen me use them. You might have even seen me using them with watercolor because I really like to use them with watercolor. They have an interference or a shimmer property to them. They have one color that shows up on white or light cardstock and a completely different color that shows up on black or dark cardstock. Because this watercolor cardstock is light, we're going for the color that shows up on the white or light cardstock. But the cool thing about the pads is even on the white or light cardstock, you still see that interference color when you tilt it into the light. Now, if you ink blend with the interference inks, you get a lot more shimmer than you do when you're watercoloring, because when you water down that ink, you're watering down the shimmer or making less shimmer. But where that color is darkest is where you're going to get that little bit, the little pools of shimmer. So what I do when I'm watercoloring is I do the darkest color around the outside edges, and then without putting more ink on my brush, I use the rest of the ink on the brush towards the center. So we have darker outlines and lighter towards the center. On that bird, I used Royal Truffle, and then I used some Opal blush on the belly of the bird as well as the end of the feathers. Now, when I do that, I also put some ink on my brush and I dot it in some of the areas where I want that ink to be darkest. And where I dot it tends to be where you get little bits or little deposits of that shimmer as well. For my branch, I thought it would be fun. The branches are mainly leaves, but there's a couple leaves that look like they almost could be buds. So I decided to pretend those were buds, and I'm watercoloring them as if they are buds. So I'm using some pink champagne interference. So this is a nice bright pink. The interference color to this is blue. So if I was to do this on black cardstock, you would see blue. You wouldn't see any pink. It's almost like magic. I regularly call these my magic pads because of the fact that you get two different looks with them. But because we're working on the light cardstock, we're seeing the bright pink from that pink champagne, and where that color is darkest, we're going to see just a little bit of that blue shimmer. For my leaves, I'm using Summer Garden mostly, but because these are spring leaves, I want them to have a little bit of a yellow tone towards the tips of the leaves. So I'm using some lemon candy for that. The Summer Garden has an interference color of blue. So where that color is darkest is going to have a little bit of a blue shimmer. The lemon candy has a pink shimmer to it, like a kind of a peachy corally pink. So where we see that lemon candy, if there's areas that are pretty dark with it, we're going to see a little bit of that pink shimmer, but we're not going to see a lot. I'm doing just a little bit of that lemon candy towards the tip of the leaf. I don't want my leaves to be yellow. I want them to be mostly green, but I wanted them to be more like spring leaves that are a little bit lighter and a little bit brighter, which is why I opted to do the ends of the leaves with the yellow. Now I'm using a water brush here that has the water in the handle, so I don't have to use a jar of water. I tend to be a klutz, so if I were to have a jar of water on my desk, there's a very good chance I would knock it over. What you can't see on screen here is I have a piece of paper towel to my right, and anytime I move my hand to the right, I'm either wiping off the excess ink from my brush, or if I'm changing color, I'm just squeezing the handle, so that flushes water through the brush and cleans it out to work with a completely different color. So I love this brush. I use this brush often, and it's so handy to not have that jar of water and chance spilling it all over. So when I'm doing this, I'm not doing all of the leaves at once. I'm doing about half a dozen leaves at once. I want to make sure that whether I start with the yellow or whether I start with the green, that doesn't have a chance to dry before I go in with the other color, because I want to blend those two together. Watercolor, if you let that ink dry even just a few minutes, that's where you start to get marks on there, and dry marks or lines, just weird. It just looks weird. It has a certain look to it that you don't want. So you want to keep that leaf wet while you add those two different colors. So by doing about a half a dozen leaves at a time, you still have that open time that hasn't had a chance to dry. You can still blend those two colors together. You could do one leaf at a time if you want, but doing one leaf at a time, switching between the different colors, it's just going to take a lot longer. Once I am finished watercoloring all of my leaves, I'm going to take some detailed cutting scissors. These tend to be smaller scissors that have a really sharp blade to it, and I'm going to fussy cut the bird and the two wreaths. It's going to take a while, so I only do a little bit of it on screen. I do the rest of it off screen while I'm having some lunch, so you don't have to watch the entire process of it. But when I'm doing that fussy cutting, I'm leaving just a tiny little halo around the vines, and on the bird, I'm doing it right around the outside edge. For the vines, I thought by having a little bit of a halo with that background cardstock or watercolor cardstock, it would just make my wreath pop a little bit from the background of my card. I plan to use just some white cardstock with some ink blending on the background for the base of my card, and I just wanted the wreath to pop up a little bit. I'm also going to use some foam pop dots to help with that, but by leaving that little bit of a halo, it just makes it so that it has a frame to it when I put it on the back. So once I have both of my wreaths fussy cut out, I can glue them together to create my branches together. I can glue them together to create my wreath. So I start with one end of the branch, putting glue on the back side. Then I use a sewing clip just to hold that in place. When I'm putting them together to create a wreath, I'm not putting one on top of the other. I'm putting the ends of the branches, the ends that have leaves on them, on top of the stem of the other branch that has the stem on it. So I want to make sure that it looks like a complete wreath and I don't see the stick from the stem. For the mat for this card, I have a piece of white cardstock here that's trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I want it to coordinate with my wreath, so I use that pink champagne interference ink and just swiped it around the outside edges and set that aside to dry so that the mat around there is going to coordinate with those buds that I have on my wreath. For the focal point of my wreath, I have a piece of white cardstock that I trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to stamp and emboss my sentiment first, and I'm using one of the sentiments from the In Full Bloom stamp set. This has a few sentiments in it that are spring themed, so I thought it would work well with this card for this hop. You could use this card or create this card for other occasions as well. You could do it as a birthday card. You could do it as, say, a sympathy card or a thinking of you card. You could do it for many different occasions. For this one, I chose a spring sentiment simply because it coordinated with the hop theme a little bit better. For my background here, I'm using 3 different colors of distress ink for ink blending that background. I'm starting with some tumbled glass, then I'm going to do some Mermaid Lagoon around the edges, and then just a little bit of Uncharted Mariner right around the edges, just to darken the edges up. I want my background to be fairly bright, but I always like to put a little bit of a darker ink around the outside edges just to frame it. I just think it looks a little bit better, and I think it highlights what's in the center just a little bit more. So once I have that Mermaid Lagoon on, I just put just a touch of that Uncharted Mariner, just concentrating it right around the outside edge. So I'm not going into the center of the card. Then I'm ready to start assembling the front of my card. Now, the one thing that I decided I wanted to do was the In Our Hearts Always stamp set has a couple of dragonfly stamps and a couple of other bug stamps. I'm not sure what kind of other bugs they are. They have kind of wings like dragonflies, but the body isn't quite as long. I'm using all of those, and I'm creating or stamping some of those along the background. I just thought it would be fun to fill in that background a little bit. And because we used interference ink for the watercolor, I'm going to use interference ink for those bugs as well. So I'm using some Regal Gray. Now, Regal Gray is a gray ink that has a purple interference to it. And the cool thing is on this background, we see some of that gray ink, but we see a lot more of the purple interference because this blue cardstock is darker than white. If it was white, we would see mostly gray and then a little bit of the purple when we tilt it into the light. And then the other thing too is because I'm stamping with it instead of watercoloring it, I'm not watering down that interference. So we're seeing more of the interference color on those dragonflies and bugs. So I stamped that a couple times just to make sure that I got a good coating of that ink on there. And you could also see that when I placed those stamps on there, I put my wreath on there just to make sure that I wasn't putting some in an area that was going to be hidden by those wreaths. I wanted to make sure that they were visible or part of them was visible. So I glued my mat down to my A2 card base, and then I glued my ink blended and dragonfly stamped background. Now I want to add my wreath. Now I thought I would put a little bit of foam dots on the background of the wreath just so that it popped up from the card a little bit. I don't have really thick foam pop dots here. They're fairly thin, but it's still going to pop it up just a little bit more to give it a little bit more dimension. So I put those foam pop dots all the way around the outside on the back of the wreath. Then I take the tape backing off of them, and then I can glue that to my wreath, and I can add my bird in the center of the wreath. Now, when I created this wreath, you could see that there's 2 little branches that go right off of that wreath. They kind of stick out. Those could be cut off if you wanted, but I kind of liked how they made it look a little bit quirky, so I decided to leave them on the wreath, but rather than having them out the 2 sides or out the top and the bottom, I kind of have them cockeyed to give it a little bit of a whimsy look. Now, to add just a touch more texture to my pieces, I'm using glossy accents on the beak of the bird for just a little bit of shiny dome dimension, and then a little bit of stickles on the base of our flower buds. I didn't do it over the entire thing, just a little bit. The stickles that I used doesn't have any color to it, so you can still see the interference ink color underneath it. It's just going to add a little bit of texture and a little bit of sparkle aside from the shimmer we already get from those interference inks. So because we overlapped those branches to create the wreath, we have a lot of texture that way. And then we also have the texture from the extra glossy accents and stickles on top of there, plus the bird sitting in the wreath. And then, of course, the additional dimension you get from having that wreath on the card with some foam pop dots, and then the metallic touch from the embossed images as well as sentiments. You'll find everything I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. And if you'd like some more spring inspiration, head on over to my Instagram page. You'll find a post with the picture of this card. And in that description, you'll find links to other people that are participating in the hop. And you can see all of the other spring inspiration that they have to share as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.